Also with us is Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institution, professor of sociology, and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland's College Park. Rashawn Ray, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'll start with you. We hear the term structural racism a lot these days. Can you define it?
So when we talk about structural racism, it's really the ways that racism permeates our policies, our laws, our rules, and the regulations that govern us. One thing that we know from sociologists such as Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who is a professor at Duke University and the former president of the American Sociological Association, is that we don't need racists necessarily in order for systemic racism or structural racism to impact our society. Some of the ways that we've seen this historically and currently, one really good example is redlining. We know that redlining is a system at play that leads to people who live in predominantly Black neighborhoods being given less access to resources, whether that be health resources, whether that be work opportunities, whether that be grocery stores. And we've seen the way even that this is played out during COVID-19 with people having less access to be able to get to a hospital. And I think one big point here, we could take cities like Baltimore or Washington, D.C., and I've done this in my analysis, and take a map, say, from 2020 or 2010 and overlay it with the map from 1910. And we basically see that Black people and white people have lived in similar places and that the income disparities that existed then are the same ones that exist today.
Dr. Rashawn Ray, there was a time when Richard Pryor, the late comedian, used to say a crucial question is, how long will this so-and-so go on? What I'd like to talk about is how long it has been going on. We hear about the 1619 Project, but how long, where and how did these underlying structures and systems come to be?
I mean, that's a great question. And I mean, in the American context, we have to be very clear that our country was founded on racism. Last year, I had the chance to interview Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and he said that America was born with a genetic birth defect on the question of race. I really like how he put that because it suggests the ways that we need to continuously work at it. At the University of Maryland, when I teach courses on race, one of the things that I tell my students is a sentence that's very, very important for how we think about race, that the social construction of race, because when we talk about race and racism, it's oftentimes about the social construction of it, the way that people think that it manifests, the way that people think that it matters for biology and culture and the like. So the social construction of race, based on the falsification of the science of race, meaning where it comes from, that if we then justify in our minds that people are biologically or genetically or culturally different, then it justifies the racial gaps that we exist. So the social construction of race, based on the falsification of the science of race, leads to the exploitation of race for economic gains. So we know that when we think historically, and I'll just highlight a few very important points for people, is that, of course, people know about slavery. And of course, people always think about 1619. The 1619 Project is a phenomenal place to start. Oftentimes people point out 1865, slavery ends. We have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. One thing that people leave out is what happened in 1876 and 1877, which was really where we started to see the end of Reconstruction. That what happened at that point was that Northerners, the part of the Union, pulled out from the South. That essentially put in place Jim Crow laws that started to affect not only the South, but that sent a ripple throughout the rest of our country. The other major point dealt with what happened at the end of World War II, or kind of during World War II, but when the stock market crashed in 1929, that President Roosevelt had to do something, a stimulus, if you will, to build back up America as unemployment was going through the roof. Mind you, unemployment, as bad as people say that it was then, there are cities, particularly predominantly Black cities like Detroit and Baltimore, that actually have higher rates of unemployment right now during COVID than people were experiencing during the Great Depression. It's just important to put that in context to how bad things are economically for people right now. But part of what happened at that point is we had a series of New Deal policies that focused on the GI Bill and Social Security. Two quick points there. Social Security left out two occupations. They left out It left out domestic work and farm work. 75% of Black people in the South worked in those occupations. When it came to the GI Bill, you had white veterans and Black veterans, like some of my relatives and ancestors, probably others on here as well, who went to fought in the war, but when they returned, they were given disparate resources. So part of what the GI Bill did was it essentially created the middle class that we know to exist today. Gave people grants to go to college, send their children to college, to be able to have grants to put down on homes, to start up businesses, all the things that we say make the middle class today. Black veterans did not receive those funds. So these policies were mandated federally, but implemented locally. This is the reason why we have so many HBCUs to this day that continue to thrive with not a lot of resources. The bottom line is that these policies impacted 8 out of 10 American families. So it's not solely about slavery, even though that's where it started in the American context, but there are repeated examples of the way that the ways that systemic racism continues to impact our society to this day.